Hello, friends. Today we are going to talk about the history of the United States of America in 6 minutes, because why not? Let's do it. Before the Europeans came along, the land we call the United States today was inhabited by hundreds of different tribes of Native Americans who had developed their own unique cultures and societies. The exact origins of these peoples are unknown, but most anthropologists agree that they arrived on the continent via a land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska about 12,000 years ago. Over time, these early Americans spread out across the continent and developed into the various tribes that would exist at the time of European contact. Some tribes, such as the Pueblo people in the southwest, were agricultural and built permanent villages. Others, like the Iroquois in the northeast, were more nomadic and lived off the land. Still others, such as the Cherokee in the southeast, developed complex societies with their own governments and legal systems. Despite their differences, all of these Native American tribes shared a deep respect for the land and its resources, which would later come into conflict with the Europeans, who would eventually conquer it. Okay, now let's fast forward a few thousand years and bring on the Europeans. The first European to explore and make it to the United States was the famous Italian explorer Christopher Columbus. Back in 1492, he was looking for a faster route to Asia when he landed in what is today the Bahamas. Although he didn't realize it at the time, Columbus had just stumbled upon the Americas. Over the next few decades, other Europeans began to explore and settle in the New World, including the Spanish, who established missions and settlements in Florida and the Southwest, and the French, who explored the Great Lakes region and the Mississippi Valley. However, it was the English who would have the greatest impact on the course of American history. The first permanent English settlement in North America was Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607. The colony struggled in its early years, but eventually became profitable thanks to the introduction of tobacco as a cash crop. This success led to the founding of additional colonies along the Atlantic coast, each with its own unique economic and social characteristics. For example, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in 1630, was initially a religious refuge for Puritans fleeing persecution in England. Meanwhile, the colony of Rhode Island, founded in 1636, was more tolerant of different religions and became a haven for those seeking religious freedom. Other colonies followed, including Connecticut, Maryland, and the Carolinas. As the colonies grew and developed, they began to establish their own local governments, which were largely modeled after the English system. This system of self-government helped to foster a sense of independence among the American colonists. As the colonies grew, so did their population. And where did all those people come from? Well, mostly Europe, actually. During the 1700s, millions of Europeans arrived in the colonies, mostly as indentured servants. Many of them were young men looking for an opportunity to own land and start a new life. However, as the colonies became more prosperous, the need for indentured servants declined, and slavery became the preferred way to ensure a steady and reliable workforce. The transatlantic slave trade thrived, bringing enslaved Africans to the colonies to work on plantations growing crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Sadly, this period also saw the beginning of the triangular trade, where European ships would carry manufactured goods to Africa, where they would be traded for enslaved people who would then be transported to the Americas. The brutality of the slave trade and the horrors of slavery would have a profound impact on American history. Anyway, as the colonies continued to grow and prosper, they began to develop a distinct American identity. The vast majority of Americans were now native-born, having been born in North America as opposed to the United Kingdom. And although they still looked to England for economic and military support, many Americans began to resent the growing restrictions placed on them by the British government. One of the first areas of conflict was over taxation. As the colonies grew, so did their need for infrastructure like roads, bridges, and public buildings. At first, this infrastructure was paid for by the colonists themselves. But as the costs grew, the British government began to impose taxes on the colonies to help pay for it. However, the colonists protested these taxes, arguing that since they had no representation in Parliament, they could not be taxed without their consent. This growing tension between the colonies and Britain would eventually erupt into the American Revolution. When Britain entered the 7 Years' War in 1756, the cost of defending the colonies against the French fell onto the colonists. They were also required to house British troops in their homes. Naturally, the colonists were pretty unhappy about this, and by 1776, tensions were high. On July of that year, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which outlined the reasons for the break between the colonies and Britain. It's a pretty great document, and you should definitely read it if you haven't already. The war that followed was long and bloody, but ultimately resulted in the creation of the United States of America. The newly formed nation was governed under the Articles of Confederation, which established a weak central government and gave most of the power to the individual states. While this system worked relatively well at first, it soon became clear that a stronger central government was needed to keep the country together. In 1787, delegates met at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. The result was a compromise between the states, giving the central government enough power to function effectively while also protecting the interests of the individual states. Under the new Constitution, the United States became a federal republic with a strong emphasis on individual rights and limited government. During the early years of the Republic, the United States faced a number of challenges. The country was deeply in debt from the Revolutionary War. There was no national bank or currency, and there was very little manufacturing or industry. However, the United States also had a lot going for it. It had a large and growing population, vast natural resources, and a stable government based on the rule of law. These factors combined to make the United States one of the most promising nations in the world. Over the next century, the United States grew and changed in ways that few could have predicted. It expanded from a small group of coastal states to a continental power. It transformed from an agrarian economy to an industrial powerhouse. And it grappled with the issue of slavery and the meaning of freedom and equality. In the early 1800s, the United States began to grow rapidly. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the country and opened up new possibilities for westward expansion. As settlers moved west, they encountered Native American tribes who had been living on the land for centuries. The result was often conflict, as the two cultures clashed over land, resources, and way of life. One of the most famous examples of this conflict was the battle between the U.S. Army and the Lakota Sioux at Little Big Horn in 1876. Though the U.S. eventually triumphed, this was one of their last great victories. Within a few decades, most Native Americans had been forced onto reservations, and the era of westward expansion was over. Meanwhile, the issue of slavery continued to cast a dark cloud over the country. From the nation's founding, there had been a debate over whether slavery should be allowed in the new territories. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily resolved the issue by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. But the compromise also established a line across the continent that would divide the United States into pro-slavery and anti-slavery halves. This division only widened as the country grew, leading to a series of violent conflicts over the issue, including the Mexican-American War and the Civil War. Speaking of the Civil War, it was arguably the most consequential event in American history. When the Southern states seceded from the Union in 1860, it seemed as though the country might break apart. Abraham Lincoln, running on an anti-slavery platform, was elected president. The Southern states argued that allowing a president hostile to slavery to take office would be disastrous for them. So they seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. When the Civil War broke out, it was unclear which side would win. But ultimately, the Union prevailed. The war resulted in the abolition of slavery and the preservation of the Union. But it also left the country divided and struggling to come to terms with the legacy of slavery. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the United States entered a period of rapid industrialization and urbanization. Millions of immigrants arrived in the country, fleeing poverty and persecution in Europe. They settled in cities where they worked in factories and mines for low wages. The wealth created during this period was immense, but it was also highly concentrated in the hands of a few. This growing gap between the rich and the poor would lead to the rise of new political movements, such as populism and socialism, as well as new forms of protest such as labor unions and the occasional violent labor strike. In the early 1900s, the United States emerged as a global power. It played a key role in both world wars and emerged from the conflicts with even more wealth and influence. After World War II, the United States faced new challenges, including the rise of new superpowers such as the Soviet Union and China. The Cold War that followed was primarily a battle of ideologies between democracy and communism, and the United States would spend much of the latter half of the 20th century trying to contain the spread of communism around the world. This effort often came at the expense of smaller nations, as the United States supported dictatorships and engaged in covert operations to overthrow governments that were seen as too friendly to the communists. Perhaps the most famous example of this was the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Iran in 1953. Despite these challenges, the United States continued to grow and change. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s worked to end racial segregation and discrimination in the South, and the women's rights movement of the same era worked to achieve gender equality. These movements were met with resistance, but ultimately led to significant legal and social changes. In recent decades, the United States has faced new challenges, including economic inequality, climate change, and political polarization. But the country continues to grapple with these issues and search for solutions. And that, my friends, is the history of the United States of America in 6 minutes. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Thank you for watching.